Hi, welcome to STEaPP Chat. Today we're going to be talking cities. I'm Ellie Cosgrave. I am the Director of the Urban Innovation and Policy Lab here at STEaPP, and I'm joined by the wonderful Tim Moonen, who is the Managing Director of Business of Cities. So what are the big ones then? What are the huge challenges that cities are trying to address right now?
Well, I think cities are where the world is expecting the major challenges of the world to be addressed, whether that's climate change, whether that's equality and social mobility, whether that's gender and inclusion, whether that's questions to do with what the future of jobs and the future economy will look like. So I think in a way cities are the places that the evidence would suggest is where much of the experimentation, much of the kind of innovation on those agendas will take place. And the challenge, however, is the fact that most cities arrive in this context without the powers, the finance, the know-how, the political support, the political integration, the technical systems to kind of deliver on all those things. So it's the grand questions and the things that motivates us. I think both of us and all of the teams we work with at the lab is thinking about in what ways can some of those gaps be filled, who's going to take the lead on that, how do we push the envelope forward in our own way, and how do we contribute to that?
So you've been travelling.
I have.
What have you been up to in Australia?
So yeah, I was in Australia just for a week last week, and big questions over in Australia around how is it that on the one hand the brand of Australia's cities is so powerful, so compelling, but on the other hand when you're actually living and breathing on the ground in those cities because of inherited sprawl, because of low investment in public transport, because of fragmentation in ownership and governance, the quality of place is actually very poor in many parts of Australian cities. And so we've been working with the cities of Brisbane and Sydney quite closely to think about how is it that they can start to build more collaborative leadership in individual districts and places. So we're working with the private sector, but also with city councils, with universities, thinking about in what way can they become custodians of the places in which they operate, which is something that they never quite really got before as a concept. And we're helping them understand what global lessons have been learned, what are the ways in which different people can take the lead. So we do a lot of that kind of work, helping cities and agencies and institutions to understand their role in this new world where cities have got to perform better, and how they can understand they've got a leadership role to play themselves.
See, this is something I think that we see all the time, is that city leaders in particular are kind of accountable for the integration of all sorts of services, all sorts of, the economy, education, healthcare, where they often don't have actually the power to act, even though they're going to be kind of held accountable by their citizens. So a lot of the work that we do in the lab, and I think the role of universities is really important, is actually to look at the ways in which cities have a convening power. At the university, what we're trying to do within the Urban Innovation and Policy Lab is to offer our expertise and what we can deliver, and kind of not necessarily, certainly not be a consultant, but all have a role in city leadership. Yeah.
I think it's an essential role that we're attempting to play, and attempting to push forward that perspective that actually all institutions are going to eventually become city leaders. If we understand city leadership in a broad sense, and that understanding how one can contribute in the most effective way is key. And it's an exciting time in that sense, because the world's expecting a lot of the cities we go to and we live in, but it's not always clear how to make headway. And in a way, there's so many inherited challenges and deficits that it's incumbent on us to kind of really ask the most of the institutions we work in and that we support.
See, this is why I do this type of work, is because there are really complex, nitty-gritty challenges. The city is really a place of tension, right? There's all sorts of needs. There's all sorts of different actors trying to create different things, and for me, engineers come out of their comfort zone and kind of go towards public policy making, and public policy makers maybe having more expansive views about the possibilities of their action is really what kind of gets me going, especially when you can hold within all of that issues of social justice and combating climate change and making sure the world is a kind of safe place for people to be in.
I think that element around how do you build the interdisciplinary awareness of professionalized industries and disciplines, and how do you get them to understand that there are different ways of seeing and sensing the city, there are different histories of how people perceive the city to have unfolded, and in what ways you can bring together those different points of view and different vantage points in a coherent policy or strategy or project. That's a really exciting thing.
How do you do that then? With, because there seems to me therefore a kind of coaching element, not for city leaders, that you support in business of cities.
Yeah, right? I think a lot of it's interesting around the world because a lot of cities face this challenge, and a lot of if you like, the element to which cities are embroiled either in embedded short-termism, a kind of faddishness of thinking, or of a kind of highly siloed way of doing things is prevalent everywhere. But the ways in which you encourage either the leaders or the institutions to work their way out of some of this vary quite a lot because of either because of their cultural appetite to doing those things, or whether it's to do with whether they're inspired by external thinking and examples and impetus, or whether they're inspired by sort of very deep and focused kind of coaching and focus of mentorship and support over a long period of time. Often we work with other organisations to think about how to do this, and I think there's a real appetite in many of the leading companies in the built environment or the technology industry who observed all the failures of the previous generations to kind of to build their own teams kind of interdepartmental, intercultural awareness, and that begins to filter down to the projects that they propose, the way they deliver them, the way they handhold and support city leaders themselves. So it's an art, not a science, and I think every city, you would say, somewhere along that journey, and different catalysts have different effects, I think, around the world.
It's really interesting because what I have certainly found, especially when we think about a distributed mode of city leadership, where for me, in my training in engineering and within the lab, we're kind of very much kind of from the technical background. Like, how do you... the challenge that I face all the time is how do I get engineers or support the engineering community to value those different types of knowledge, and where we haven't been taught it, or when it's not intrinsic with us. So how does an engineer, for example, understand social justice, understand the role that infrastructure plays in inequality, when we don't teach engineers about the basic social theories, and they're seen as kind of peripheral, not a real thing. And so a lot of the work that I'm trying to do is gently encourage people, not to say that there is one right way, but to gently kind of share different possibilities of knowledge and expertise, and bring that together in a way that contributes to something and doesn't lead to more kind of tension.
And when you notice individuals or even larger groups and teams that have begun to embrace this wider perspective, what do you think has really been the thing that's contributed to that?
It's always about an open mind. Well, I want to say open-heartedness, but when I say that, I'm like, oh, engineers at heart. It's not a thing. Of course, it's a thing, but there is a certain level of kind of curiosity and gentleness, rather than closed down and I'm right, and how dare you suggest that what I've been doing and what my father did and my grandfather did is not good. I think there is a certain sense of actually we're all coming from a place that's useful and valid, and potentially some types of knowledge are more needed in one situation than another. But if we can kind of hold a space for these kind of more complex discussions to happen, that's where we get progress and innovation. And that's what we try and do in our teaching as well, as you know. our students are very much from interdisciplinary backgrounds. We've had planners, we've had people from Chinese civil service, politics students, engineers, learning about the city, learning about the where the city is trying to go all together, and we kind of then I'll get a dancer to come and give them a lecture and make sure that it's relevant to their experience.
Yeah.
So.
And as you say, I like the phrase, the idea of holding that space, because it's all about it not being a transactional moment where they get exposed to that in one session or one example, but it's somehow, how do you practice according to that, and how do you develop a sort of a problem or a proposition that they actually need to address involving different agendas and perspectives. I think that's something I've really seen come to fruition in the lab's work and the MPA programs have been developed, how much there's a real sense in which that becomes grounded in real everyday challenges for real policymakers, and how do you reframe that rather than just simply expose people, you actually ground it in the real.
And it could be super frustrating, right? So I'm like sprinkling different bits of pixie dust of here's some engineering knowledge, here's some computer science knowledge, here's and whatever, dancers and artists, and make of that what you will, right? So the frustration becomes, but what's the right answer? But how will I know what's a good solution? And I always say, there is no perfect answer, and when we can bring it together in what we actually care about in the world, what we're trying to make a difference in, then we know how to pick different pieces of knowledge and put them together in a safe way. And I think that's what we need to support public policymakers in doing as well, in terms of holding that space, because the city is always going to be evolving. It's always going to have like contested spaces. It's always going to be some sense of tension, and given, as you said before, often the limited powers of city authorities, how can you kind of convene the people who do have power and knowledge and capital to make these things happen?
Yeah, I think that's super important, and there's something to me also about how do you help the community of people who want to build better cities to understand that it's not a template, it's not a one size fits all, there isn't a solution or a kind of set of checklist factors that you can simply tick off and then you created a great project or a great city or something else. But actually it's about understanding for the whole all of these things in tension. There are trade-offs, there are choices, there are priorities you have to make, and not being frightened to sort of wrestle with that, equally not shying away from the fact that there will be some things that are immediately advantaged and some things that are not advantaged, and how that should be something we embrace, I think, collectively, and we're more honest as a community of practice globally if we accept all of that, I think.
So in that context then, how do we create some sort of, at least, feeling of certainty about a direction of travel within a policy context that needs, leadership, which in many senses does have to, of course, incorporate the tension, the fuzziness, the not knowing, and the kind of insecurity, but yet kind of say, here's where we're going.
Yeah, well, I think we do quite a lot of work at what you might call more of a macro level, thinking about what is the 30 or 50 year kind of direction that a big city will need to be thinking about, and how do you turn a kind of a noble plan of aspiration into something that feels like a strategy, or feels like something that's got purpose, it's got legs, it's got deliverability, it's got the tools to implement, and all the things that in a way have been missing in many cities and have led to a big sense of fatigue about where they're going. And I think there's a lot of stuff about how do you build build the sequence of things that need to happen? How do you get the quick wins to build momentum? How do you achieve maximum buy-in? How do you avoid all the communication failures that make it look like, oh, this is just this public sector doing its thing, or if it's just the private sector doing its thing? It's a huge kind of minefield, but I think you see in some cities around the world that there's an awareness that you've got to move from understanding the city you want to be into something where you're developing the right kind of tools, the right kind of pilots, the right experiments, the right coalitions to deliver things. And I think that's the kind of the way that we're heading towards. And I think where we enjoy, I think all of us contributing, is that sense of, well, what are the ways in which you do that? What are the tactics? What are the personalities? What are the choices that really do that? And that's where the fun starts.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I've enjoyed working with you guys on a lot, is through our executive education and looking at how can we work with city leaders as well. We have done it in an engineering firm, but what are the tools, the techniques, the core principles of public management that we can work with and align with, so that we can actually contribute to an agenda. Yes, potentially in some cases for kind of business profit and for those sorts of things, but also for being part of a planet that we want to live in and contribute to.
It's been super rewarding, hasn't it? And I think for us, we can sense that many of the world's leading companies and institutions are now pivoting towards cities as being something that they want to contribute to, not just profit from. And therefore, there's an awful lot of opportunity to kind of upskill and support that process of awareness about how do cities really work, how do you contribute to that, what are the ways in which you can align your own business's strategic and growth imperatives with a sense of what do the cities that you work in, and what does your market require. And I think overall we're seeing a positive process where companies who have made high profile mistakes, and companies who have moved too quickly to think that they know the answer in cities, are recognizing actually collaborative solutions are what works. Actually, it's about thinking beyond your kind of individual solution or individual product, and thinking about how do you harness that to achieve the kind of multiple outcomes and catalytic effects within a city. And I'm hopeful actually that all the companies that we think are synonymous with cities today will have gone through a process over the next 10, 20 years where they all become very literate in cities, and where we can help do that's fantastic.
And I think we've been talking maybe in quite vague terms or high-level terms about what are the challenges in cities. So we've been talking about climate change, inequality, urbanisation, housing, education, the economy. But I wonder, is there any more specific examples that you've been working with recently on kind of maybe a specific city issue in a specific city that you've been supporting?
Yes, I mean it's. I would say, just to pick an example, as I mentioned, we're doing a lot of work in Australia. A big challenge in cities like Sydney, for example, that we help the various agencies in government and outside government to think about is, well, if your city's going to double in size over 30 years, what will the spatial and physical and economic fabric of your city look like today in 2050 compared to today? What does that mean, for example, in terms of how people who are moving to your city or moving to the edge of your city, in Australia's cases, how they're going to build attachment, affinity, pride, cultural expression, how they're going to access amenity, conviviality in a context where there's a lot of low density, low amenity environment being developed, and helping the cities think about what is the future of culture, what is the future of cultural production, cultural consumption, where will it happen, how will it happen, what does it mean in terms of the way that you need to activate different locations in your region and to play bigger and better roles than they currently do. And that's been really exciting and rewarding to do, because it really does cut into not just the big stuff to do with where do you build infrastructure and where do you build your big kind of land development projects, but also what is the way in which people's relationship to cities is going to change. And I think that's a huge thing that we touch on in all the different work that we do, is how will city identity, city pride, city kind of the ways in which, if we are moving, at least in some ways, away from a system of nation states and nationalist identity, how will cities enable those kind of attachments to form properly rather than just transactionally? And it's been great fun to work with. These are all very new questions, and some cities have been thinking about it for a little while, but it's mostly very new. So that's been really fun to do. And again, I guess it made me realise doing that work how much politics and governance actually affects even things that are often seen to be highly, unrelated to sort of things that are political. Actually, the way that people sample and engage in their everyday environment, it is the product of many other systems and choices. And so that's what's so endlessly fun to kind of discover, is the way that politics and governance shape real outcomes everywhere in the city.
Yeah. I mean, I think our students, again, were quite surprised about the focus that we put on cultural infrastructure, understanding kind of the tensions that happen within a developing city, specifically like London, and how you can, support culture as the lifeblood of the city in terms of people's mental health, cultural feeling of identity with the place, access to jobs, and all of those sorts of things. And we have a group project this summer working with the World Cities Culture Forum. So we're looking at kind of how they have this huge survey of all of the cities that they have in terms of what data they have about cultural development in the city. And the project that the students themselves have chosen is to look at how does diversity, or what they call super diversity within cities, support cultural development, and how can you create policies for a super diverse place that supports the kind of cultural vibrancy of the place. So
fantastic questions.
Watch out for September, where and specifically the role of data and big data in and the possibilities that gives for how you decide to invest and when. So I might be asking for your help.
Oh well, we're looking forward to that. But what you just mentioned reminds me of another thing that we collectively, I think, really contribute in the work we do at the lab to thinking about cities, which is just that question around how do you analyse, how do you measure, how do you compare, how do you develop a set of performance, if you like, diagnostics, or more broadly, in what ways are we understanding cities, and what are the ways in which, because the science of cities is a kind of such a immature field, really, in what ways can there be misapprehensions about what's going on in cities, in what ways can we support better ways of gathering data, even thinking about the way that we even would observe what's going on in cities. And that's I think something that cuts across all of our work, and it's going to be an exciting time over the next 10 years with the exponential data, but also exponential risk of misidentifying and misdiagnosing. And that will be something to watch as well, I guess, in both of our sets of work. Yeah,
and it goes back to exactly what we were saying earlier on about how do we know, what kind of knowledge and expertise do we use, and how do we combine those together. So yeah, amazing stuff.
I hope you enjoyed this STEaPP chat. Until next time, stay tuned and stay curious.